Hello, students. Nice to see you back for another topic. Ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to be starting to jot some notes down in your books. So take a moment and make sure that you open up your books to our lesson notes page 4. Cell structures. That is our topic for today, for this week, and certainly we will begin our notes today on cell structures. Hopefully, yesterday you got to watch a number of the hyperlinked videos throughout the lesson notes and saw some interesting ones about cell structures. So let's put together some of that information in your science books in a way that will make it easier for you to study throughout the week. So, as we begin, let's talk a little bit about cells and what they are. And maybe when I say cells, you might start singing a song in your head. Cells. Cells. They're made of organelles. Try to pull a fast one and the cytoplasm gels. Did you watch that video yesterday? It's a rather catchy tune, I must admit. All right, so what are cells? Well, cells are kind of like the basic building blocks of all living things. Here are some building blocks, and you know that when you've got some building blocks, you can build pyramids, you can build towers, you can build various types of structures and shapes. You can do a lot of different things. If you've got building blocks, you can make a lot of different kinds of structures. Well, in a similar way, all living things, as far as we know on planet Earth, are made up of cells. And these cells are, in fact, the basic building blocks of all living things, and they are made of even smaller structures called organelles. And in a little while, we're going to be focusing on these organelles that each individual building block of a cell is made up of. Gets smaller within a cell. So cells, the basic building block of all living things, and are made up of organelles. Well, who came up with this idea in the first place? Well, there is a theory called the cell theory. And this cell theory was developed through the work of not just one scientist, but 3 famous scientists in particular that are credited with developing a cell theory. And some of the names may look familiar to you. Hooke. Robert Hooke. You may recall that name. Isn't he the one who came up with the name cell in the first place? Yeah, so Robert Hooke, a lot to do with cells. The next one you may also remember when we talked about microscopes, because he was the scientist of the week then, Van Leeuwenhoek. Leeuwenhoek is the second scientist who helped develop this cell theory. And the third one, you may not have heard of yet unless you were listening to some of those videos yesterday. And you may recall the name Matthias Schleiden. Slip sliding away, slip sliding away. It's an old song from my time period. Schleiden. So Hooke, Leeuwenhoek, and Schleiden. And these 3 scientists, not necessarily all together, but at different times even, they contributed different ideas to what we call the cell theory. So let's get right to the cell theory, shall we? There are 3 main points of this particular theory. So let's list them now. Number 1, all living things are made of cells. This is a fact that we have established already. We talked about it at length last week. but all living things are made of cells. So you've got a picture here of all these different kinds of critters. Now, I know these are just cartoon pictures, but in real life, if we were to take samples from all of these different critters and magnify the samples under a microscope, we would see that, in fact, all living things on planet Earth, as far as we know, are made of these basic building blocks that we call cells. So that's the first point of the cell theory. The second point of the cell theory is that cells are the basic unit of life. Now, what does that mean? Well, what that means is that if you were to break apart a cell, as we're going to be doing, metaphorically speaking, when we examine the inside pieces of cells, but if you break apart a cell, physically break it apart, you've killed it. It's no longer alive and it can no longer function. In other words, if you take an organism, whether it's a plant, animal, fungus, protist, what have you, bacteria, and you look at its overall structure and you examine its structure, the simplest structure that you can break it down into is a cell. You can't break down organisms any further than the cellular level and still consider it a living thing and being alive. So cells are the basic unit of life. Now, can you break down a cell further? Yes, absolutely. And next year, when we study physics and chemistry, we'll learn that cells are made out of basic building blocks of all matter. We'll get into elements and atoms, but for life, cells are the basic unit of life. What's the third point? The third point may sound a little bit familiar to you from last week. Last week, we talked about Francisco Redi and how he disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. And he formulated the concept, the idea that, living things come from living things. Well, on a cellular level, the same is true. Living cells come from living cells. If you examine your skin, let's say you get a boo-boo. Oh, I got a cut on my finger. Ouch. And your body has to produce skin cells to repair that injury. Guess where those skin cells are going to come from? Other skin cells. You don't just put a piece of cellophane tape over a boo-boo or even a Band-Aid over a boo-boo and expect that tape or that Band-Aid to generate spontaneously more skin cells. It doesn't work that way, although there are genetic scientists out there who are trying to come up with synthetic ways of generating living tissue, but that's a topic for later in the year. As far as the cell theory is concerned, living cells come from living cells. So here are the three main points of the cell theory. All living things are made of cells. Cells are the basic unit of life. And finally, living cells come from living cells. All right, I think we got that down pretty well. Make sure you study those three main points of the cell theory for the quiz later this week. But let's move on for now. Because as I mentioned earlier, each of those individual building blocks can in fact be broken down into smaller pieces. Now, each of those smaller pieces in and of themselves cannot function independently of one another. You can't take them apart and have them just work by themselves. They really need to be together as a unit. Think of a clock, for instance, an old-fashioned clock with gears and what have you. You take out some of those gears and the clock just isn't going to work. But does a clock have gears? Well, sure it does. You can think of a car. A car is a unit, and you want a car that's going to function. So you don't want to be just ripping out parts from your car's engine and expecting it to work. All of those units, all of those different items work together in order to make that unit, the car, function correctly. And it's the same with these things that we call organelles. Organelles are tiny cell structures that allow a cell to function. And we're going to discuss now the 10 basic structures that are found inside cells that we call organelles. Because remember, cells, they're made of organelles. All right, so let's begin, and we're going to work from the outside of a cell inward. And let's begin with cell walls. Now, you will notice that there are, as we go through this list, there are two organelles that don't exist in all cells. And this first one is an example of one that only exists in plant cells. And so item number one here is a cell wall. Cell walls, you can think of them as like a bunch of bricks all together, or concrete blocks. You could probably think of other examples of walls as well. But cell walls are only found in plants, and they provide support and protection. Now, let's think about this for a moment. We are human beings. We are mammals. We're a type of animal, and as such, we have what's called an endoskeleton. An endoskeleton is a structure on the inside of us. This time of year, you see lots of scary skeletons, being put up around neighborhoods and so forth. We have a skeleton inside of us, and our skeleton helps hold us upright. Imagine if we didn't have a skeleton inside of us. If we didn't have a skeleton, what would my body look like right now? Well, it would look like a pile of mush. I'd be a blob. There'd be no structure whatsoever because my skeleton holds me together. Not only holds me together, but forms me the way I am. I'm able to move around. I can stand up, sit up, move my arms, move my fingers, move my hands. I'm able to do all of those things because I have a structure inside of me called a skeleton. Well, what about bugs? Bugs don't have an inside skeleton. No, they have what's called an exoskeleton. And bugs are held together with this exoskeleton, this outside structure that holds them upright. But think about plants for a moment. Plants don't have a skeleton. They're not animals, for one. They're plants. But yet many plants, especially land plants, need to have a structure of support so that they can grow and develop and carry on all of those other life functions we talked about last week. And the way they are able to accomplish this, plants that is that on a cellular level, their cells have cell walls. So these cell walls provide the support they need, and it also provides the protection from the outside environment. So organelle number one, cell walls. And remember, cell walls are found in plants only. That's going to be important, and we're going to come back to that later on. So cell wall, plants only, support and protection. Now I'm going to show you a couple pictures here. Here's a picture, and you'll notice this is a magnified view of cells, and in particular, plant cells. You'll notice that there are darker lines and there are lighter areas in this image. The darker lines here are showing, because this is a real sample of cells, you're seeing the cell walls right now. This is the structure of cell walls. In fact, when Robert Hooke looked at cork under the microscope and coined the term cell, it was actually the cell walls of that cork, which is from a plant, that he was observing. And he noticed that they looked a lot like the cells in the honeycomb of a beehive. So that's how he came up with this name. It was something similar to this that he was looking at that gave him the idea of cells. If we look at this, maybe we could imagine these are like jail cells, all arranged along a hallway here, perhaps. But these are cells, plant cells, and the darker blue lines are the cell walls themselves. Here's another image of a different kind of cell. I think this is an onion cell slide. And actually, on the inside of these cells, you can see these structures. We'll talk about those later, but those are actually the nuclei of cells. But the cell walls here have a slightly different shape to them. They're not perfect rectangles because different species of plants can be made up with different kinds of cells. But in all cases, plants have these structures that we do call cell walls. So here again, another example of cell walls. So let's move on to our next organelle. Cells, they're made of organelles. Well, the next organelle we're going to discuss is called the membrane. The membrane, it can be found in both plant and animal cells, and the membrane is also known as the doorway to the cell. It is something called semi-permeable. Ooh, that sounds like a good vocab word, semi-permeable. Well, think of a doorway for a moment. We're in a room right now, and some of you might be thinking, boy, I just want to get out of this room because I'm in this room all day long. Golly, gee willikers. Well, there's only one way out. No, you don't want to go out the windows. You're going to go out the doorway eventually. That's how people, teachers and students, get into and out of a classroom. It's how you get into and out of a car. It's how you get into and out of a house, a building. We are very familiar with doors. So it's a great analogy with a membrane to a cell because the membrane, which is semi-permeable, allows certain things through and other things not. I mean, think about this for a moment. You're home and you're hungry and you order pizza. So the pizza guy comes to your house and delivers a pizza, knocks on the door, and you look out the window and you say, oh, he's got my yummy pizza dinner. What do? You open the door and allow the pizza through because you're hungry and you want the pizza. But what if somebody else knocked on your door and it was somebody that you did not want to let into your house for whatever reason? Are you going to open the door if you don't want them to come in? Probably not. And so they won't be allowed to come into your house. Like, let's say there's a black bear roaming around and it starts clawing on your front door of your house. Are you going to open up that door and let the bear in? Yeah, I know. Some of you might, but the average person would not be opening the door. So doors allow some things through and not other things. Now, I have another example or an analogy of a membrane. Does anyone know what this is? Anyone recognize what this is? Yeah, it's a strainer. It's a strainer. Now, there are big ones, small ones. They come in different sizes and shapes. But if you've ever made pasta, for instance, or boiled vegetables, you know that when the pasta or the veggies are all cooked, you separate out the water from the pasta or the peas. And you can use a strainer like this because, well, you tell me, what happens when you use a strainer? Can anyone tell me? Very good. Yeah, the water goes through, but the pasta or the peas stay behind. In other words, this strainer is semi semi-permeable. Again, semi-permeable means some things can go through and not other things. So the membrane to a cell allows some things through and yet doesn't allow other things through. And as we proceed through this topic, you'll see how, well, that's kind of an important thing for cells to be able to regulate or control what's going through the membrane or not. And in this picture here, we can see some of these guard cells. These are like the doorways in a cell membrane that can either open or close for different things, and they can be selective. So this is difficult to see here, but here's a picture of a cell membrane, which is really, really small. You can see this measurement here. It's less than 5 nanometers. Now, that's a tiny number. But here are the structures, these little guard cells that I mentioned on a cell membrane. Here's a close-up view of a cross-section of the cellular membrane, and you can see that it can be, well, relatively thick, like a wall, that in different places can allow materials through them. So cell membrane is our next organelle. So we're diving inside the structure of a cell. So hopefully it lets us in so that we can go inside and see the next one. Oh, here we go. Yes, number 3. The nucleus of a cell is also known as its control center. Now, just like many things, if you have, let's say you have a cell phone. If you were to take your cell phone apart, you'd see a little computer chip in there. That's the control center of your cell phone. If I were to take this computer in front of me apart, it would have a motherboard. And on the motherboard, there'd be computer chips. If you take apart electronic devices, many electronic devices have little bits and pieces. Some of them, like this one, is like an integrated circuit that controls things. If you rip this out of a device like I have, guess what? The device won't work anymore because there's nothing there to direct the various functions. If you did this to me, popped open my skull and removed my brain, I would no longer be alive because none of my body parts, none of my organs, no matter how healthy they might be, would not be able to function if they did not receive the instructions and the direction from the brain itself. And so every cell has a nucleus which is at the center of the cell, and it's directing all of the activities of that cell. And so it's a very, very important part. But really, it's no more or less important than any of the other organelles, because if all you had was a nucleus inside of a cell with no other organelles to control, well, it's not going to be directing anything. So nucleus, control center of the cell, arguably a very important part of the cell. So here we have an image of some stained plant cells, and you'll notice you can definitely see the darker lined areas. What do you think those are, everybody? Very good, cell walls. And what do you think these really dark circular areas are in the middle of the cells? Yeah, the nucleus. There's many nuclei in this particular slide of plant cells. Here's another example. We actually saw something like this similar just a few moments ago. These are onion cells, plant cells, and you will notice the cells are not all rectangular, but inside the cells, are these spherical areas that we call the nuclei. They are definitely one of the more obvious organelles that we will be able to see when we look inside the microscope at various cells. And we are going to be examining the nuclei of cells later this week when we get to the lab activity. So let's move on, because there's more to a nucleus than meets the eye, so to speak. Because the nucleus is almost like a cell inside of a cell. Because a nucleus, and I'll just show you a quick model here right now. Here's a model of a cell, and the big circular area inside is the nucleus. But check it out, there's even something inside the nucleus. And that thing that's inside the nucleus, there's another doorway called the nuclear membrane that allows you to get inside the nucleus before you can even examine what's inside the nucleus. So there's another membrane, kind of like this, that allows even fewer things through. Now, we may remember the strainer, the cell membrane, like this. Well, here's the nuclear membrane. And any coffee drinkers among you? Wow. At your young age, you're drinking coffee already? Golly, I haven't even started drinking coffee yet. Some people say I'm naturally caffeinated. I have so much energy, but I don't even drink caffeinated beverages. No coffee, no tea, no soda for me, because I've got enough energy, like the Energizer Bunny. But anyway, some people who make homemade coffee, well, yeah, they might have a one of those Keurig devices where they put a K-cup in, but some people might actually use these things in a percolator or a coffee maker, where they put coffee grinds in the top, and then they put water in, and in this device, hot steamy water goes through here, and only the coffee liquid filters through, and all the coffee grinds stay behind. This filter is also semi-permeable, but it allows even fewer things through than that strainer we looked at before. So this is kind of a good example of what the nuclear membrane is like. It's even more selective as to what can get in and what can get out of the nucleus. Now, well, what's in there that's so important? It's like a double locked door. Well, that is a good analogy, because, yeah, there is some really important stuff inside the nucleus, believe me, including the chromosomes. The chromosomes, as we will discover in the next couple weeks as we explore this even further, they direct activities in the cell. They're located within the nucleus, but they are responsible for a lot of stuff that makes you you. You have certain color eyes, you have certain color hair because of your chromosomes. You have certain activity levels because of your chromosomes. You have a certain metabolic rate because of your chromosomes. Your chromosomes direct very important activities, and they are nestled within this tinier little structure that I pointed out on this model of a cell. This is the nucleolus, and the nucleolus is like a little nucleus inside the bigger nucleus, which really is pretty small when you consider the size of most cells. Most cells are, in fact, microscopic. Not all of them, but most of them are microscopic. So here we have the nucleus, inside of which can be found the nuclear membrane, the chromosomes, and the nucleolus. Okay, so these are 3 of the 10 organelles which we are going to be discussing this week. And I am going to end this first part of our video here today at this time, because we are going to discuss the remainder of our organelles tomorrow. We'll finish up the list of organelles tomorrow, and then we'll get ready for our lab activity on Thursday once again. So at this time, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to go back to Google Classroom and follow the instructions I have left there for you, and I will bid you adieu by saying bye-bye for now.